In 1833, soldiers digging a grave in Lompoc Rancho, California, broke through a layer of cemented gravel and found a skeleton. It was 12 feet tall, surrounded by carved shells, stone axes, and blocks of porphyry covered in symbols no one recognized. The discovery was reported. It was documented. Local scholars were called in to examine it. And then, within weeks, it was ordered to be reburied. No museum, no further study, no public record beyond the initial report. Just gone. This is not a single incident. Across the world, in dozens of countries, across thousands of years of human history, the same story repeats itself. Enormous skeletal remains discovered, briefly documented, and then quietly removed from the public record. Ancient texts from every major civilization on Earth, describing races of giants that once walked alongside ordinary humans. Myths so consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other that the consistency itself becomes evidence of something. Something large walked this earth before us, and the question that has never been fully answered is not whether they existed. The question is what happened to them. This is that story. The ground keeps its secrets with patience, not the patience of scholars who wait for funding, or of governments who wait for political convenience, or of museums that wait for provenance to be established before they acknowledge what they hold, but something older and more indifferent than any of those things. The patience of Earth that has been compressing the same layers for 10,000 years, folding what once existed above the surface down into the dark where the light cannot reach it, burying what happened before in the sediment of what came after, and occasionally, without planning and without preference, giving something back. The 19th century was the great age of accidental discovery. Railways were being cut through previously undisturbed land across North America and Europe. Mines were being sunk to depths that no previous generation had reached. Agricultural operations were breaking ground on fields that had not been cultivated in centuries, sometimes millennia. And in the soil displaced by all of this industry, things emerged that the people finding them had no framework to explain. Bones, primarily. Not the ordinary bones of ordinary people. Not the remains of individuals whose proportions fell within the range that human anatomy was understood to produce. But something different. Something that required the people holding them to measure twice and then measure again, because the measurements produced by the first pass seemed impossible. 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet, 12. Skeletal remains reporting dimensions that contemporary medical and anatomical understanding had no category for. Remains accompanied, in many cases, by artifacts, tools, weapons, ornaments, structures that matched the scale of the bones they were found with. Not human-sized objects in proximity to oversized remains. Objects built for the beings they were buried with. The reports accumulated through the course of the century. They appeared in newspapers, in the proceedings of regional historical societies, in the correspondence of surveyors and engineers and farmers, who had no reason to fabricate what they were describing, and every reason to simply report what their eyes had shown them. The Smithsonian Institution received more than 1,000 reports of giant skeletal finds between 1,850 and 1,900. 1,000 reports, from credible sources, from locations spread across the entire North American continent, from contexts that included Native American burial mounds, cave systems, dry lake beds, and construction sites where the stratigraphy made the age of the deposits difficult to dispute. And almost none of those remains entered the permanent public record. Almost none of them can be examined today. Almost none of them were ever formally studied by the institutions that received the reports. The ground gave them up, and then through a process that is neither fully documented nor easily explained, they disappeared again. Not back into the earth, into the silence of institutional decisions made without public accountability. The reports that built a pattern. To understand the scale of what was documented, it is necessary to move beyond individual cases and consider the accumulation as a whole, because the power of this evidence does not lie in any single find. It lies in the consistency. In 1879, a mound excavation in Brewersville, Indiana, yielded a skeleton measured at 9 feet 8 inches. It was examined by a committee of local officials and reported in the Indianapolis News. The skeleton was placed in the custody of a local collector. It was last seen sometime in the 1890s. In 1891, workers excavating a mound near Crittenden, Arizona, uncovered a stone sarcophagus containing a mummified figure estimated at 12 feet in height. The discovery was reported to the Arizona Gazette. The remains were shipped to an unnamed Eastern institution for study. No subsequent report was ever published. In 1897, a coal mine near Wellsville, Ohio, exposed what miners described as a stone wall running beneath the seam. Behind the wall was a chamber containing skeletal remains of multiple individuals, all reported to be between 7 and 9 feet tall. The mine's owners reported the find to the local newspaper. Within days, men arrived from an institution they declined to name, removed the remains, and departed. The same structure. Again and again. Discovery, documentation, removal, silence. This pattern is not, by itself, proof of anything. Individual cases can be explained by misidentification, hoax, exaggeration, the unreliability of untrained observers measuring unfamiliar objects. The 19th century had no shortage of sensationalism, and newspapers of the era were not distinguished by their commitment to verification. But the pattern itself, the sheer repetition of the structure across decades, across geography, across independent sources with no connection to each other, demands a more serious response than simple dismissal. What dismissal cannot account for is not any individual case. What dismissal cannot account for is the consistency. The mound builder question. Central to any honest examination of the giant skeletal evidence in North America is the question of the mound builders, the cultures that constructed the tens of thousands of earthen mounds that once dotted the landscape of the eastern United States, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. These were not small structures. Some of the largest mound builder complexes involved earthworks containing millions of cubic feet of deliberately placed soil, organized into geometric patterns of extraordinary precision, aligned with astronomical phenomena, with an accuracy that required both sophisticated mathematical knowledge and sustained organizational effort across generations. The mounds also contained burials, thousands of them, and the reports of the excavations conducted during the 19th century, many of them documented by the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, included, with notable regularity, descriptions of skeletal remains that exceeded ordinary human dimensions. Cyrus Thomas, who led the Smithsonian's mound survey in the 1880s and 1890s, documented numerous sites where remains described as unusually large were found. His final report, published in 1894, remains one of the foundational texts of American archaeology. What is less frequently discussed is what the report omits: the disparity between the field notes of the surveyors, which describe anomalous remains in multiple locations, and the final published text, which treats the mound builders as entirely within the range of ordinary human variation. The field notes said one thing, the published report said another. That gap between what the people in the field documented and what the institution chose to publish is not a minor footnote. It is a significant question about how scientific institutions manage evidence that does not fit their established frameworks. The institutional response. The Smithsonian Institution's role in the giant skeletal evidence story is the subject of serious, documented controversy that deserves more careful attention than it typically receives. In 2000, a legal case was brought under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in connection with the remains known as Kennewick Man, a skeleton found in Washington state in 1996, whose physical characteristics were unusual enough that the initial forensic report described it as potentially Caucasian in origin, raising immediate questions about the standard narrative of pre-Columbian North American population history. The legal battle over Kennewick Man lasted nearly a decade and exposed the degree to which institutional control over skeletal remains had been exercised in ways that were not always transparent or scientifically motivated. The Army Corps of Engineers, acting in coordination with the Smithsonian, had initially attempted to rebury the remains before any study could be conducted, an action that a federal court ultimately blocked. What was the specific concern about what study might reveal? These questions have never been answered satisfactorily, and they are not unique to the Kennewick case. They echo through the entire history of the giant skeletal reports. The consistent pattern of remains being removed from independent custody and transferred to institutional control, followed by the consistent pattern of those remains never being publicly studied or displayed. The cases that define the pattern. To understand what was actually being reported during the period of maximum giant skeletal discovery, and why the reports demand more serious consideration than they have received, it is necessary to look at the specific cases that are best documented. The Lompoc Rancho discovery of 1,833, referenced at the beginning of this video, is one of the earliest and most detailed. The soldiers who found the skeleton were engaged in official government work. Their report went through military channels. The skeleton was examined by multiple witnesses before being ordered reburied. The order to rebury came from above, from someone in the chain of command who had reasons, unstated in the surviving record, for not wanting the find studied further. The size reported 12 feet is at the extreme end of the documented range, but it is the surrounding details that make the case significant beyond the dimensions. The carved stone blocks covered in symbols. The stone axes sized for hands much larger than human. The shells arranged in patterns consistent with ritual rather than accidental accumulation. This was not a single anomalous bone displaced from its context. It was a burial, a deliberate ritual interment of a being treated in death with the same care and ceremony that cultures apply to their most significant members. Whatever this being was, the people who buried it considered it important enough to bury with ceremony. The 1,891 Crittenden, Arizona discovery provides a different kind of documentation. A stone sarcophagus, not a mound, not a pit burial, but a carved stone container, implies a level of material culture and social organization that challenges the assumption that the beings contained in it were pre-civilizational. Sarcophagi are made by cultures that have the craft specialization to carve them, the social organization to commission them, and the theological framework to consider them worth the investment. The Santa Rosa Island chain, off the coast of California, has produced a decades-long series of skeletal finds associated with what archaeologists call the Channel Islands Chumash, a maritime culture of considerable sophistication. Among the materials recovered from these islands are skeletal remains that, in several documented cases, show dimensions exceeding the normal range for the population. The island chain is geologically isolated. Its population would have developed relatively independently of mainland groups for thousands of years. If an unusual physical type persisted there longer than it did on the mainland, protected by the same isolation that allowed other unusual characteristics to develop in island populations throughout the Pacific, the Channel, islands would be exactly the kind of location where such persistence would be expected. And then there is the Lovelock Cave evidence, perhaps the most extensively documented and most persistently disputed of all the North American giant cases. Lovelock Cave, in Nevada, was excavated beginning in 1912 by the University of California. The excavation produced an extraordinary quantity of well-preserved organic material, including textiles, baskets, duck decoys of remarkable craftsmanship, and skeletal remains. The remains were documented, measured, and in several cases reported as being of unusual stature. Local Paiute oral tradition, recorded by ethnographers in the 19th century, described the cave as the site of a conflict between the ancestors of the Paiute people and a prior population. They called the Saitaka a race of red-haired, cannibalistic giants who had been driven to the cave and burned inside it. The cave contained evidence of burning. The skeletal remains showed, in several documented cases, reddish hair, a characteristic so unusual in indigenous North American populations that it was noted specifically in the excavation reports. The oral tradition and the physical evidence matched, and the skeletal remains that matched most specifically were, in subsequent institutional handling, reclassified and reclassified again until the specific characteristics that made them anomalous were, in the formal record, no longer anomalous. But the buried bones of North America are only one thread in this story, because the giants were not an American mystery. They were a global one, and the oldest civilizations on Earth had been writing about them for thousands of years. Every major civilization that left written records left records of giants, not as fantasy, not as metaphor, not as the kind of embellished heroic exaggeration that inflates the achievements of legendary warriors to supernatural proportions, but as sober, matter-of-fact historical description, the recording of a reality that the people writing about it considered entirely factual, worth documenting alongside ordinary historical events because it was an ordinary part of the world they inhabited and the history they had received from their predecessors. This consistency across independent cultures is the element of the giant question that resists the simplest dismissals. Cultures that had no contact with each other. Cultures separated by oceans and mountain ranges, and centuries of independent development. Cultures whose languages shared no common roots, and whose mythological frameworks emerged from entirely different ecological and social contexts. All of them wrote about giants. All of them placed giants in the same general relationship to ordinary humanity before us, alongside us for a time, and then gone. And all of them described the going in terms that implied catastrophe rather than gradual change. The Hebrew tradition and its specificity. The Hebrew scriptures contain what is probably the most extensively detailed ancient textual treatment of giants in any surviving literary tradition, and also the most specific about their origin, their nature, and the reason for their disappearance. The book of Genesis describes the Nephilim, a Hebrew word whose root is disputed, but which most scholars connect to concepts of falling or casting down as the offspring of unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men. The passage is brief in the canonical text, but the tradition it references was clearly far more extensive in the broader literary environment from which the canonical books were drawn. The Book of Enoch, a text excluded from the Hebrew canonical scriptures, but preserved in full in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, and referenced extensively in the Dead Sea Scrolls, provides the complete version of the story that Genesis alludes to. In this account, a group of divine beings, the text calls them, the Watchers descended to earth, took human wives, and produced offspring of immense physical stature. The Watchers also transmitted to humanity knowledge that humanity was not supposed to possess: metallurgy, the crafting of weapons, the use of cosmetics and ornamentation, astrology, and the interpretation of signs. The giants produced by these unions, the text calls them the Nephilim, and describes their height in measurements that vary across manuscript traditions, but consistently indicate extraordinary size became a problem. They consumed the food supplies of ordinary humans, then consumed the humans themselves, and then, the text says, with a directness that is striking in its plainness, they consumed each other. The flood, in this tradition, was not primarily a punishment for human wickedness. It was a targeted destruction of the giants, a reset imposed from above, because what the Watchers had created had become unmanageable. The specificity of this account is worth pausing over. It is not the vague, allegorical language of myth. It is narrative cause and effect, action and consequence, a sequence of events that implies a specific historical memory, however encoded that memory may have become in the process of transmission. Mesopotamia and the memory of the first kings. The Sumerian king list is one of the oldest surviving historical documents in the world, a clay tablet compilation of the rulers of Mesopotamian city-states extending back, in its own reckoning, to before the flood. And the pre-flood section of the king list records something that modern scholarship has largely treated as embarrassing numerology: reigns measured not in years, but in sars, with individual kings ruling for periods of tens of thousands of years. The standard interpretation of these numbers is that they are mythological inflation, the same kind of symbolic use of large numbers found in other ancient traditions, and that interpretation may be correct. But there is another reading, one that the Mesopotamian tradition itself supports. In ancient Near Eastern cosmology, the pre-flood era was not simply a longer version of the post-flood era. It was a qualitatively different world, inhabited by qualitatively different beings. Beings whose lifespans and physical dimensions corresponded to their nature as beings closer to the divine than to the fully human. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving long-form narrative in any language, centers on a king described explicitly as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, who is also described as physically enormous, capable of feats that ordinary humans cannot match, and accompanied by a companion, Enkidu, created by the gods from clay, as an equal for him. Gilgamesh is not described as a hero in the way that later literary traditions use that word. He is described as a different kind of being, larger, stronger, longer lived, other, and the trajectory of his story, the death of Enkidu, his failure to achieve immortality, his final return to the walls of Uruk, as an ordinary mortal king reads, from the perspective of the giant question, as a cultural memory of the transition from one kind of world to another, the world before, in which such beings existed, and the world after, in which they no longer did. The Greek mythology is so thoroughly saturated with giants that it is easy to overlook how specifically and consistently they are described in relation to ordinary humanity. The Titans, the generation before the Olympian gods, are described as being of enormous physical stature, as having ruled the world during a prior age, and as having been defeated and imprisoned rather than destroyed. The giants proper, the Gigantes, are described as born from the blood of Uranus falling on the earth, as armored in the scales of serpents, as having fought a war against the Olympian gods that required the intervention of a mortal hero, Heracles, to be won. But the most precise Greek account of the giant question, and the one that most closely parallels the Enochian tradition, is the myth of the ages of man. In Hesiod's telling, humanity did not begin with the people who existed in his own time. Humanity began with the golden race beings of extraordinary virtue and physical perfection, who lived without labor and without death, as ordinary humans experienced it. They were followed by the silver race, inferior in both character and constitution. Then the bronze race, violent and self-destructive. Then the race of heroes, the demigods, who fought the great wars. And then, last and least, the iron race, which was Hesiod's own age and ours, each race physically diminished from the one before it. Each age shorter lived, less capable, less close to the divine than the age that preceded it. What Hesiod describes, encoded in the language of myth, is a world that began large and has been getting smaller. A humanity that began as something closer to what we call giants and has progressively contracted toward what we now consider normal. India, China, and the global pattern. The pattern extends far beyond the Mediterranean and Near Eastern traditions. The Vedic texts of ancient India describe the Daityas and the Danavas races of beings of enormous physical stature, who inhabited the earth in prior ages and who fought extended wars against the gods and against ordinary humanity. The Mahabharata contains detailed descriptions of individual warriors of superhuman size. Bhima, for example, is consistently described as being of a stature and strength that places him outside ordinary human parameters. The tradition is explicit that the beings of former ages were physically larger than those of the present age, and that each successive age has been characterized by diminution. Chinese tradition preserves memories of giant beings in its earliest historical layers. The legendary Emperor Yan the Divine Farmer, one of the three sovereigns who are described as the founders of Chinese civilization, is described in some texts as being of extraordinary physical stature. The classic texts of early China describe the sovereigns of the primordial age as beings of a different physical order than ordinary humans, closer to heaven, possessing capabilities that later generations lost. The traditions of sub-Saharan Africa, of Polynesia, of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, virtually every cultural tradition that preserves memory of a time before the present age preserves alongside it the memory of beings who were larger than what currently exists. The myth of the giant is not a myth. It is a memory. The question is whether the thing it remembers was real. Because, while mythology remembered giants, the ground was quietly producing evidence. Evidence that science has struggled to explain, and in some cases, has struggled to acknowledge. The science of human skeletal remains is not a simple discipline. Forensic anthropology, the study of human remains for the purpose of establishing identity, age, health history, and cause of death, is a sophisticated field with well-established methodologies and a detailed understanding of the range of normal human physical variation. Within that range, the upper limits of stature have been well documented. The tallest verified human being in recorded history, Robert Wadlow of Illinois, reached 8 feet, 11 inches before his death in 1940. His condition, hyperactive pituitary gland, producing excess growth hormone, represents the physiological mechanism by which human beings of extraordinary stature can be produced. This is important context, because it establishes that human beings can, under specific pathological conditions, reach heights that would have been considered impossible before the mechanism was understood. And it raises a question that is rarely posed directly in mainstream academic discourse. If a single individual with a pituitary disorder can reach nearly 9 feet in height in the 20th century, what becomes possible if the pituitary function were differently calibrated at a population level over hundreds of generations in response to environmental or dietary conditions that no longer exist? The answer is not obvious, and the reluctance of mainstream science to engage with it seriously is itself worth examining. Gigantism and its mechanisms. The medical condition of gigantism excess growth resulting from elevated growth hormone production, typically caused by a benign tumor on the pituitary gland, is well understood in its modern clinical form. It is a pathological condition, meaning it represents a deviation from the normal functioning of the human endocrine system, and it carries with it significant health consequences: joint problems, cardiovascular strain, reduced life expectancy. But the assumption that extraordinary stature must always represent pathology, must always be the product of a malfunctioning system rather than a differently calibrated one, is an assumption, not a scientific conclusion. It is an assumption drawn from the specific population of very tall individuals that modern medicine has observed in a very limited historical window, under the very specific conditions of contemporary human physiology. The paleoanthropological record complicates this assumption in ways that are rarely discussed. Gigantopithecus blacki, the largest known primate in evolutionary history, stood an estimated 10 feet tall and weighed up to 1,200 pounds. It coexisted with early human ancestors in Southeast Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, before disappearing approximately 100,000 years ago. Its existence demonstrates that very large primates are biologically possible, that the upper limit of primate body size extends considerably beyond what currently exists, and that the disappearance of large forms does not require impossibility, only changed conditions. Gigantopithecus was real. It was enormous, and it disappeared. Its disappearance is itself instructive. The dominant theory holds that it went extinct due to climate change at the end of the Pleistocene. The same climate transition that eliminated the woolly mammoth, the cave bear, the saber-toothed cat, and dozens of other megafaunal species across every continent. The world, at the end of the Pleistocene, was not merely cooler or warmer than what came before. It was fundamentally different in ways that had catastrophic consequences for the species that had adapted to the prior conditions. If Gigantopithecus could disappear this way, the question of whether a giant human lineage could have undergone a similar elimination is not a question that science can dismiss simply on the grounds of implausibility. The Denisovan problem. In 2010, a finger bone discovered in Denisova Cave in Siberia produced a genetic result that shook paleoanthropology more thoroughly than almost any discovery of the preceding century. The finger bone did not belong to a modern human. It did not belong to a Neanderthal. It belonged to a previously unknown species of the genus Homo, a species so genetically distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals that it represented an entirely separate evolutionary lineage, one that had diverged from the common ancestor of modern humans and Neanderthals, perhaps 800,000 years ago. The Denisovans, as the new species was named, had lived in Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They had interbred with both Neanderthals and early modern humans. Evidence of the latter is preserved in the genomes of contemporary Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian populations, who carry between 3 and 5% Denisovan DNA. They had been sophisticated enough to produce ornaments and tools that implied cognitive capabilities previously attributed only to modern humans. And then they had disappeared, completely, without leaving any descendants that carried a majority of their genetics, without leaving, for the most part, any physical remains that could tell us what they actually looked like. What little evidence exists for Denisovan morphology is suggestive. The teeth recovered from Denisova Cave are significantly larger than those of modern humans. large enough that the initial analysis considered the possibility that they belonged to a different genus entirely before the DNA established their human lineage. A mandible fragment recovered in Tibet indicates that Denisovans at high altitude had jaws of a robustness that exceeds anything in the modern human range. The Denisovan story does not prove the existence of giants in the sense that the ancient texts describe them, but it does prove something that the mainstream scientific consensus had not previously acknowledged, that there were human-related species of unusual physical characteristics living on Earth within the period of modern human existence, that those species interacted with our ancestors, that they disappeared, and that the physical evidence of their existence is startlingly sparse given how recently and how widely they appear to have lived. Unknown species, unusual physical form, disappeared without clear explanation. Sound familiar? The Patagonian giants. One of the most extensively documented giant encounters in the historical record involves the indigenous people of southern South America, a group that European explorers consistently described across multiple independent expeditions spanning 2 centuries as being of extraordinary physical stature. Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe in 1520 produced the first European accounts of the people of Patagonia. Antonio Pigafetta, the expedition's official chronicler, described an encounter on the coast of what is now Argentina with individuals of a height so far exceeding the European norm that the expedition members came barely to their waists. Pigafetta's account is detailed, specific, and written by a man whose role was precisely to observe and record accurately. He was not the last. Subsequent expeditions, including those of Francis Drake in 1578, Thomas Cavendish in 1587, and numerous others through the 17th century, produced consistent accounts of the Patagonian people as beings of extraordinary physical stature. The accounts varied in their specific measurements, but they consistently placed the inhabitants of this region at heights ranging from 7 to 9 feet. By the late 18th century, the accounts had shifted. The Patagonian people, encountered by later explorers, were described as tall, notably tall, but within the range of ordinary human variation. The extraordinary stature of the earlier accounts had apparently diminished or disappeared. What happened between 1,520 and 1,780? The conventional answer is that the early accounts were exaggerated, that Europeans encountering people of simply above average height, in an unfamiliar context, inflated their dimensions through a combination of surprise, poor measurement conditions, and the general tendency of early travelers' accounts towards sensationalism. This explanation is possible. It is not fully satisfying given the consistency and detail of the accounts and the credentials of some of the observers. And it does not account for the biological mechanism by which a population that was genuinely of above average height might have been reduced to ordinary dimensions within 2 centuries of intense European contact. Disease is the most likely answer. The great biological leveling that European contact brought to indigenous populations across the Americas, a catastrophe so total that it reshaped the demographics of an entire continent within a few generations. But if disease could reduce a population of unusually tall people to ordinary dimensions within 2 centuries, by selectively eliminating the individuals most genetically associated with extraordinary stature, then the same mechanism could, in theory, have operated on a larger scale, over a longer period, to eliminate a population of genuinely giant individuals from the human story entirely. Because the question was never really whether giants existed. The evidence for their existence, physical, textual, archaeological, is too widespread to dismiss with a single explanation. The question is what ended them, and the answer, when you look at it carefully, is not one thing. It is several, operating simultaneously, in a window of time that the evidence allows us to place. If the giant question has a central temporal problem, it is this. The evidence points consistently to a specific window of time, roughly 12,000 to 6,000 years ago, during which something fundamental changed about the large-bodied presence in the human story. Not coincidentally, this is the same window that contains several of the most significant transitions in Earth's environmental and human history. The end of the last ice age, the Younger Dryas cooling event, the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna, the beginning of agriculture, the emergence of the first urban civilizations, the global flood traditions that appear in the mythological record of virtually every culture on Earth. everything changed at once. And the giants, if the evidence is taken seriously, disappeared in the middle of all of it. The Pleistocene extinction event. The end of the Pleistocene epoch, approximately 12,000 years ago, was the most significant extinction event in the last 60 million years. It was not as dramatic as the Cretaceous extinction that eliminated the non-avian dinosaurs, but it was catastrophic for the large-bodied animals that had dominated every major continent during the preceding 2 million years. In North America, where the evidence is best studied, approximately 70% of all large mammal genera went extinct within a relatively brief period centered on roughly 12 to 10,000 years ago. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths the size of modern elephants, short-faced bears standing over 11 feet tall when upright, American lions significantly larger than their African counterparts, American cheetahs, saber-toothed cats, every large predator, every large herbivore, gone not gradually, not over millions of years of competitive replacement, but within a period that is, in geological terms, essentially instantaneous. The cause of this extinction is one of the most actively debated questions in paleoanthropology and geology. Two main hypotheses compete. The first is overkill the argument that early human hunters, arriving in North America for the first time and encountering animals that had not evolved alongside human predators, simply hunted the megafauna to extinction. The second is climate change. The argument that the dramatic environmental shifts accompanying the end of the last ice age eliminated the habitat that the megafauna depended on. The evidence supports both, to varying degrees, in different regions. But there is a third factor that has entered the debate more recently and with growing force: impact. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. In 2007, a team of researchers published evidence for what they called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the proposal that approximately 12,900 years ago, a fragmented comet or asteroid struck or exploded over the North American ice sheet, triggering a period of rapid cooling, widespread fires, and catastrophic environmental disruption across the Northern Hemisphere. The evidence they presented included a layer of nanodiamonds, microspherules, and shocked quartz materials associated with high-velocity impact events found consistently in sedimentary deposits, dated to the Younger Dryas boundary at sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. A black carbon layer in those same deposits indicated widespread burning across enormous areas. The presence of platinum and iridium elements, rare in Earth's crust, but common in extraterrestrial material in the boundary layer, added to the picture. The hypothesis has been contested. Science proceeds through exactly this kind of debate, but the physical evidence has accumulated rather than diminished over the intervening years, and a significant portion of the scientific community now accepts some version of it. If a major impact event occurred at the Younger Dryas boundary, the consequences would have been severe and immediate. Enormous wildfires across North America and beyond, triggered by the thermal pulse of the impact or airburst. A rapid cooling event lasting over 1,000 years, caused by the dust and particulates injected into the atmosphere. Disruption of the ocean circulation patterns that moderate temperature across the Northern Hemisphere. The collapse of the ice sheet over North America, releasing vast quantities of cold fresh water into the North Atlantic, and potentially triggering the kind of catastrophic flooding that appears in the global mythological record as the Great Flood. Everything that the ancient texts describe happening to end the world of the giants, the fire from the sky, the flooding of the land, the destruction of a prior civilization, fits within the physical evidence for what happened at the Younger Dryas boundary. Not metaphor, not myth. Physical events, documented in the sedimentary record, consistent with the kind of catastrophe that would end a large-bodied species that was already under pressure from other directions. The convergence of catastrophes. What makes the Younger Dryas period particularly significant for the giant question is not any single event, but the convergence of several simultaneous pressures, each sufficient to threaten population survival, all operating at the same time. Climate disruption, potentially impact-triggered, dramatically altering the vegetation zones and food resources that large-bodied animals depended on. Human hunting pressure, intensifying precisely as the climate stress was reducing herd sizes and increasing the vulnerability of individual animals. Epidemic disease, plausibly accelerated by the same climate disruptions that force species into contact with new environments and new pathogens. And genetic isolation, the separation of populations by the environmental changes, into groups small enough that inbreeding depression becomes a factor in their long-term viability. Any one of these would have been a significant stress. Together, operating across a period of centuries, they would have been catastrophic for any population already limited in number, as a population of very large-bodied humans would necessarily have been, given the caloric requirements of maintaining a giant body in a world where food resources were suddenly and severely disrupted. Large bodies need large amounts of food. In a period when food was suddenly scarce, the largest bodies would have been the first to fail. The mathematics of survival in a catastrophic environment consistently favor smaller, more efficient bodies. Smaller individuals require fewer calories. They can survive on a wider range of food sources. They reproduce faster. They adapt more readily to changed conditions. If a population of giant humans existed at the Younger Dryas boundary, the catastrophic events of that period would have imposed exactly the selective pressure that would, over the course of several thousand years, eliminate or drastically reduce them. Not through dramatic, sudden death in all cases, though the impact event and its consequences would have caused dramatic, sudden death for many, but through the slower arithmetic of differential survival, in which smaller bodies outlast larger ones when resources are scarce. The flood in every language. One of the most striking features of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, when considered alongside the ancient textual record, is the way it provides a physical mechanism for events that every ancient tradition describes as literal historical memory. The Great Flood. Some version of it appears in the oral and written traditions of cultures, separated by every possible barrier of geography and language. The Mesopotamian flood narrative predates the biblical account and shares with it specific details: the warning given to a single man, the construction of a vessel, the release of birds to test for dry land, the grounding of the vessel on a mountain, the covenant with the divine after the waters recede, that cannot be explained as parallel literary invention. The specificity is too great. The structural correspondence is too precise. Indigenous North American traditions preserve flood narratives across dozens of independent linguistic and cultural groups. The peoples of the Pacific Polynesia, Melanesia, the islands of the Pacific Rim preserve them. The traditions of sub-Saharan Africa preserve them. The traditions of South Asia preserve them in the story of Manu, the Indian Noah, whose account parallels the Mesopotamian and biblical versions with a consistency that has occupied comparative mythologists for 2 centuries. Every culture on Earth that has preserved memory of a time before the present remembered a flood that ended it. Not a metaphorical flood, a real one, described in physical terms. Associated with specific events, fire falling from the sky, darkness, cold, the destruction of a prior world, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis provides, for the first time in the history of this question, a physical mechanism adequate to produce the kind of global catastrophe that the flood traditions describe. The combination of an airburst or surface impact over the North American ice sheet, the catastrophic melting and release of the waters locked in that ice sheet, the disruption of the thermohaline circulation of the world's oceans, the years of reduced solar input from particulate injection into the atmosphere, all of this would have produced a catastrophe experienced globally, within the memory of human populations alive at the time, and preserved in the oral traditions that those populations maintained for the tens of thousands of years between the event and the development of writing. And in those same flood traditions, with a consistency that has been underappreciated, appears the same figure, the giant, the beings who were present before the flood, the beings who were eliminated by it, or who survived it in reduced numbers, or whose offspring mixed with ordinary humanity in its aftermath. The flood traditions and the giant traditions are not separate mythologies in the ancient record. They are the same mythology. The giants are the people of the world that the flood ended, the survivors and what they built. If the Younger Dryas catastrophe was the event that ended the giant lineages or the civilization associated with them, then the question of what came immediately after is one of the most important questions in human prehistory. Because the archaeological record shows something remarkable happening in the period immediately following the Younger Dryas cold phase, in the roughly 2,000 years between approximately 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. Agriculture appears, independently, in multiple regions of the world, not gradually, not through the slow refinement of hunter-gatherer practices over millennia, but within a relatively brief window that, in the context of the 2 million-year human story, is essentially instantaneous. The the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, New Guinea, West Africa, all within a few thousand years of each other, all after the Younger Dryas, none before it. The first permanent settlements appear, the first evidence of social hierarchy, the first long-distance trade networks, the first use of writing, or its immediate precursor, in the form of systematic symbolic notation, the first astronomical observations recorded with sufficient precision to have survived as identifiable data, the first monumental architecture of a scale that implies organized labor beyond the family or clan level. Everything that we call civilization appears within a few thousand years of the catastrophe, not before it, after it. The standard explanation is that the end of the Ice Age created the environmental conditions that made agriculture possible and population growth sustainable, and that civilization emerged as a natural consequence of those changed conditions working on the existing cognitive capacities of modern humans. This explanation has a degree of validity. The changed climate did create new possibilities, but the speed of the transition, the near simultaneity of the emergence of civilization in multiple independent locations, all within a tight window following the catastrophe, is not easily explained by slow environmental adaptation alone. Slow adaptation produces slow change, spread over long periods. What the archaeological record shows is rapid change, concentrated in a specific period, as if a significant portion of the starting position for civilization was provided rather than independently developed, provided by survivors, people who had come through the catastrophe, carrying knowledge that ordinary hunter-gatherers did not possess, knowledge that, in the ancient traditions, was associated specifically with the race of beings that the catastrophe had nearly eliminated. But elimination is not the only possibility, because there is a third option that the evidence, read carefully, actually supports. Not that the giants were destroyed, not that they simply died out, but that they were absorbed. The discovery of Denisovan DNA in living human populations changed the framework of the giant question in ways that have not yet been fully processed by the broader public conversation about prehistoric humanity. Before the Denisovan discovery, the narrative of human prehistory was relatively simple. Modern humans emerged in Africa, expanded across the world, and replaced the archaic human forms they encountered, Neanderthals, in Europe and the Middle East, Homo erectus in Asia, other regional variants elsewhere. The replacement was understood to have been competitive. Modern humans outcompeted the archaics for resources, drove them from their territories, and ultimately eliminated them. The genetic evidence has complicated this picture fundamentally. Modern humans did not simply replace the Neanderthals, they interbred with them. Every person of non-African ancestry alive today carries between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. The legacy of encounters between early modern humans and Neanderthal populations in Europe and the Middle East that produced offspring capable of breeding with both parent populations, and they interbred with the Denisovans. And the genetic evidence increasingly suggests, with at least one other archaic human population that has not yet been physically identified from fossil evidence, but whose genetic signature appears in certain African populations, suggesting that there was at least one more lineage of ancient humans living in Africa during the period of modern human emergence, a lineage that has left physical traces only in the DNA of living people and has yet to produce a single identifiable fossil. There were more of them than we knew. There were more kinds of us, and we absorbed them more than we replaced them. The genetic legacy of extraordinary stature. If a lineage of large-bodied humans or human relatives existed during the Pleistocene, and the physical, textual, and archaeological evidence suggests something along these lines, then the genetic legacy of that lineage might be detectable in the DNA of contemporary human populations, just as the Neanderthal and Denisovan legacies are detectable. This is not a fringe proposition. The study of archaic genetic introgression, the incorporation of archaic human DNA into modern human genomes through interbreeding, is one of the most active and productive areas of current paleoanthropological research. The methods are established. The findings for Neanderthals and Denisovans are robust, and the search for additional archaic signatures in modern human genomes is ongoing and producing results. Some of those results are suggestive in ways that connect to the giant question. Certain alleles associated with stature genetic variants that contribute to taller than average height show patterns of distribution in contemporary human populations that are consistent with archaic introgression. They appear at higher frequencies in certain populations than the standard models of human genetic drift would predict. They are found in combinations with other genetic variants that suggest a non-modern human origin, and they cluster, statistically, in ways that point toward an ancestral population of greater average stature than any currently existing human group. We may carry, in a diluted form, the genetic legacy of the giants, not as a curiosity, not as a trace so small it is meaningless, but as a contribution to the full range of human physical variation that exists today. The very tallest people alive today, the populations of the Netherlands, the Dinaric Alps, certain East African groups consistently exceed the global average stature by margins that are not fully explained by the known genetic and nutritional factors that influence height. The question of where the genetic capacity for exceptional human stature comes from has not been answered, and the possibility that some portion of it represents an archaic inheritance from a lineage that was, on average, much larger than modern humans, has not been seriously investigated. The Nephilim in the genome. The Enochian tradition, the text that provides the most detailed ancient account of the origin and fate of the giants, says something important about what ultimately happened to them. Not all of them died. Not all of them were destroyed by the flood. The text describes the destruction of the physical giants as thoroughgoing, but it also describes the survival of something, a spiritual essence, or in more material readings of the text, a genetic legacy that persisted into the post-flood world. The Nephilim appear again in the Hebrew scriptures after the flood narrative. Goliath, whom David kills with a sling stone, is described as being from a family of giants in the land of Canaan. The spies sent by Moses into Canaan before the Israelite conquest report that the inhabitants include giants, before whom the Israelites felt like grasshoppers. Whatever the literal historical accuracy of these specific accounts, they preserve a tradition that the giant line was not completely ended, that it continued, diminished, and dispersed into historical times. That individual examples of the physical type associated with the giants continued to appear, generation after generation, in populations that had largely contracted to ordinary human dimensions. The last of the giants did not necessarily die at once. They thinned. Their line was diluted, generation by generation, through interbreeding with smaller populations, until what remained was too diluted to be recognized as a separate lineage, but the capacity remained. Embedded in the genome, occasionally, in the right combination of inherited variants, expressing itself as a person of extraordinary physical stature, a person who in a prior age would have been unremarkable, but who, in the reduced world that came after the catastrophe, stood out as something different, as a giant. The living evidence. The absorption theory receives its most direct support, not from ancient texts or archaeological anomalies, but from the ongoing reality of extraordinary human stature in every contemporary human population. Robert Wadlow reached 8 feet 11 inches before his death at age 22. His condition gigantism, caused by a hyperactive pituitary gland, is well understood in its mechanism. But the mechanism raises questions that have not been fully explored. The pituitary gland's production of growth hormone is controlled by a complex system of genetic regulation. The variants that lead to pathological overproduction in individuals like Wadlow are, in genetic terms, recessive. They require the confluence of specific alleles inherited from both parents to produce their effect at full strength. This means that the genetic variants that cause extraordinary stature must be present in the population at a level sufficient to occasionally produce the homozygous combinations that result in full gigantism. The variants that produce giants in individuals are, at lower concentrations, present in millions of people who never become giants. They contribute to height across the full range of the population. They are not errors. They are part of the population's genetic diversity. Where did they come from? The standard answer is mutation random variation that entered the population at some point in the past and has been maintained at low levels because it is not strongly selected against. This answer is scientifically respectable but incomplete. It does not explain why the variants associated with extraordinary stature show, in some populations, patterns of distribution consistent with archaic introgression, rather than de novo mutation. It does not explain why they cluster with other genetic variants in ways that suggest a shared ancestral origin outside the main modern human lineage. The Denisovan introgression is the model. The Denisovans contributed alleles to contemporary human populations, alleles related to immune function, to high-altitude adaptation, to other traits that provided adaptive advantages in specific environments. Those contributions were not distributed randomly across all populations, but concentrated in the groups that had the most contact with Denisovans. If a giant lineage population contributed alleles to contemporary humans in the same way through interbreeding during the long period when multiple archaic human forms coexisted, then the distribution of stature-associated variants in contemporary populations should show patterns consistent with that kind of geographically concentrated inheritance. Research into this question has not been systematically conducted. The question has not been seriously asked. It should be. The cultural memory, as genetic memory, there is one more dimension to the absorption theory that deserves consideration: the relationship between what cultures remember about the giants and what the physical evidence from those same cultures actually shows. The traditions that describe giants most specifically and most consistently, the Hebrew, the Mesopotamian, the Greek, the Indian, the Celtic, are also, not coincidentally, the traditions associated with populations that show the highest average stature in the contemporary world. The correlation is not perfect. There are exceptions in both directions, but it is notable, and it is not explained by the standard account. The peoples of the Dinaric Alps, Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, are among the tallest populations in the world, with average male heights exceeding 6 feet 2 inches. These same peoples preserve among the richest traditions of giant lore in European folklore, with specific and detailed stories of giant beings inhabiting their mountains in a prior age. The peoples of East Africa, particularly the Nilotic groups such as the Dinka and the Tutsi, are among the tallest populations in the world, and are also, in their oral traditions, among the most specific about descent from beings of extraordinary stature who inhabited their region before the present age. What if the culture remembers, in mythological form, what the genome carries in biological form? What if the stories of giant ancestors are the cultural expression of a biological reality that the genetics are only now beginning to detect? This is not a simple claim. It cannot be demonstrated without the research that has not yet been done. But it is a hypothesis consistent with the evidence, with the physical, the textual, the genetic, and the cultural evidence taken together as a whole. And it is the kind of hypothesis that deserves investigation rather than dismissal. But if this is the picture that the evidence suggests, physical remains in the ground, genetic traces in the genome, consistent memory in every ancient culture, then why is none of it part of the standard story? Why does the official account of human prehistory contain no giants? And who decided that? The disappearance of the giant skeletal evidence from the public and scientific record is not a conspiracy in the theatrical sense, not a coordinated, centrally directed campaign of suppression, with a single identifiable purpose and a chain of explicit orders. It is something more mundane, and in some ways more troubling. It is the ordinary operation of institutional science, the way that paradigms organize what is considered worth studying, what is considered credible evidence, and what is considered an appropriate use of scholarly time and institutional resources. And it is the specific application of those organizing principles to a question that the dominant paradigm, for reasons that are partly scientific and partly social, has been unable to accommodate. How paradigms work. The philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, described, in his 1962 work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, the way that scientific paradigms, the organizing frameworks within which normal scientific work proceeds, handle anomalous evidence. His description is precise and widely accepted, and it applies directly to the giant question. Normal science, Kuhn observed, does not proceed by investigating every anomaly. It proceeds by assuming that anomalies are noise measurement errors, observer mistakes, hoaxes, misidentifications, and focusing its resources on the questions that its current framework is equipped to answer. Anomalies are not ignored exactly. They are filed. Noted as interesting, left for later, for when the framework has developed sufficient tools to address them, But when anomalies accumulate, when there are too many of them, from too many independent sources, too consistent in their characteristics, to be explained as simple noise, a paradigm faces a crisis. Either it develops the tools to incorporate the anomalies, or it resists incorporating them for as long as it can, because incorporation requires acknowledging that the framework itself is incomplete in ways that its practitioners did not previously recognize. Resistance is the normal response. Not conspiracy, not malice, normal institutional conservatism. The history of science contains dozens of examples. The long resistance to continental drift, to the germ theory of disease, to the impact origin of the Cretaceous extinction. In each case, the evidence accumulated. In each case, the institutional response was initially resistance. In each case, the eventual acceptance of the anomalous evidence required not just its demonstration, but a generational shift in the people who constituted the scientific community. The retirement of the scholars most deeply invested in the prior framework. The giant question is still waiting for that shift. The specific role of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian Institution's relationship to the giant skeletal evidence deserves more direct attention than it usually receives in discussions of this topic. The institution was established in 1846, and by the latter half of the 19th century had become the primary federal repository for archaeological and anthropological materials collected from across the United States. Its Bureau of Ethnology, established in 1879 under the direction of John Wesley Powell, was charged with the systematic study of the indigenous peoples of North America, including the documentation and excavation of the mound systems that were being rapidly disturbed or destroyed by agricultural and industrial development. Powell's bureau collected an enormous quantity of material, and it operated within a specific theoretical framework that Powell himself had been centrally involved in establishing. The framework that placed all North American indigenous peoples within a single basic category denied the existence of any prior, more sophisticated culture that might have been responsible for the most elaborate mound complexes, and treated reports of anomalous skeletal remains as either misidentifications or deliberate hoaxes. This framework had both scientific and political dimensions. Scientifically, it aligned with the prevailing evolutionary anthropology of the late 19th century, which organized human cultures into a developmental hierarchy with Western European civilization at the apex, and all other cultures ranked below it, according to their apparent distance from that standard. Politically, it served interests that were not purely scientific. A prior sophisticated civilization in North America, capable of constructing the elaborate mound complexes, would have complicated the legal and moral framework that was being used to justify the removal of indigenous peoples from their lands. The paradigm that denied the anomalous remains was not value-neutral science. It was science entangled with the politics of its moment, as it always is. This does not mean that every giant skeletal report from the 19th century was accurate. It does not mean that the Smithsonian was consciously suppressing evidence of non-human beings. It means that the institutional framework within which the evidence was evaluated was structured in ways that made incorporation of that evidence extremely difficult, regardless of its quality. And it means that the physical remains that were transferred to Smithsonian custody during the period of maximum giant skeletal reporting, the 1860s through the 1900s, were incorporated into a system that was not designed to preserve them as significant, study them as anomalous, or present them publicly as evidence of anything outside the established framework. They were filed, and in the imperfect cataloging systems of the 19th century, filing often meant losing. The modern archaeological establishment. The situation today is in some ways better, and in some ways worse than it was in the 19th century. It is better in that the methodological tools available for the study of ancient human remains have advanced beyond anything the 19th century could have imagined. Ancient DNA analysis can now extract genetic information from samples tens of thousands of years old. CT scanning can assess internal bone structure without destructive physical examination. Isotopic analysis can reveal dietary and geographic information from skeletal remains with extraordinary precision. If the giant skeletal remains that were reported in the 19th century were available for modern study, the questions they raise could potentially be answered with a definitiveness that was simply not possible for the scholars who first encountered them. But those remains by and large, are not available. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, a piece of legislation with entirely legitimate purposes in terms of returning remains to descendant communities, has had the secondary effect making many skeletal remains that were in institutional custody unavailable for scientific study. Remains that have been repatriated are reburied, and the scientific information they might have yielded goes with them. This is not an argument against NAGPRA or the rights of indigenous communities over their ancestral remains. It is an observation that the combination of 19th century institutional mismanagement and 20th century legislative solutions to that mismanagement has produced a situation in which the physical evidence most relevant to the giant question is, for practical purposes, inaccessible. The opportunity to study it may have quietly slipped away, perhaps before its full significance was ever understood. The sacred hill of Göbekli Tepe and what it may suggest. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe has encouraged scholars to revisit parts of the established narrative of early human history. Few archaeological sites of the past century have prompted such broad reconsideration of what ancient societies may have been capable of achieving. The site was first identified by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt in 1994, with excavation beginning the following year and continuing until his death in 2014. What gradually emerged from the hillside was a complex of circular stone enclosures. Each contained large, T-shaped limestone pillars, many decorated with carved images of animals in abstract forms, arranged in patterns that appear deliberate and carefully organized. Radiocarbon dating places the earliest construction at roughly 12,000 years ago near the close of the last ice age, a time associated with significant environmental shifts remembered in both geological records and cultural traditions. The people who constructed Göbekli Tepe lived before agriculture became widespread, before permanent settlements in the usual sense, and before pottery or metal tools were part of daily life. In the traditional archaeological framework, they would be described as mobile hunter-gatherers, nearing the transition into settled society. Yet they coordinated the quarrying, shaping, transport, and placement of limestone pillars weighing many tons, arranging them with notable precision across a hilltop site that must have required cooperation and shared effort over long periods of time. A common interpretation is that modern perspectives may underestimate the organizational capacity of mobile societies. This view is not unreasonable. Anthropological research in recent decades has increasingly recognized that pre-agricultural communities could maintain complex social networks and coordinate large collective efforts when circumstances required it. But Göbekli Tepe presents another quiet puzzle. After a period of use perhaps centuries, the builders appear to have deliberately filled in the enclosures themselves, carefully covering the structures they had invested generations in creating. They did not abandon it. They did not let it decay. They buried it. Intentionally, completely. Why would people bury a monument they had worked so hard to build? The only remotely satisfying answer is that they were hiding it, protecting it from something or someone, or preserving it against a future when it would be needed again, burying it where it would survive whatever was coming. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe were survivors of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, or the descendants of survivors, carrying forward in their building practices and their astronomical knowledge the traditions of a world that the catastrophe had largely ended, then the deliberate burial of the monument makes a different kind of sense. It was not abandonment, it was archival. A message left for the future in the most durable medium available. 12,000 years later, the message was found. We are still learning to read it. The pattern of deliberate obscuring. The institutional silence around the giant skeletal evidence did not begin with the Smithsonian in the 19th century. It has deeper roots than that. And understanding those roots makes the modern institutional pattern more legible. When the early Christian church established its canon in the 4th century, it excluded a number of texts that had been widely read and highly regarded in the preceding centuries of Jewish and early Christian tradition. Among the most significant exclusions was the Book of Enoch, the text that contains the most detailed ancient account of the Nephilim and their origin. The book was not lost, it was excluded. The distinction matters. The theologians who assembled the canon were aware of Enoch. Several of the canonical texts they selected contain references to it. The Epistle of Jude quotes Enoch directly. The decision to exclude it was deliberate, and the reasons for the decision were not entirely theological. a text that attributed the origin of human civilization to unions between divine beings and human women, and that described the offspring of those unions as giant beings of enormous destructive power, was theologically inconvenient for a tradition that was building its anthropology around the unique creation of humanity in the image of God and the unique dignity of the human form. The exclusion of Enoch was an early example of the same pattern that would repeat itself with the giant skeletal evidence 15 centuries later. Evidence that complicates the established framework is not addressed. It is managed, filed, excluded from the canon of what is considered worthy of serious attention. This pattern is not unique to religion or to institutional science. It is a feature of how all human institutions manage anomalous information. Information that, if taken seriously, would require not incremental adjustment, but fundamental revision of the organizing framework. Fundamental revisions are threatening. They require acknowledging that what was previously certain was actually uncertain. They require redistributing the authority that was built on the prior certainty. They require the people who built careers and reputations on the old framework to concede that the foundation of those careers was incomplete. Institutions do not do this easily. Institutions do this only when the evidence becomes too overwhelming to manage. And that moment, for the giant question, has not yet arrived. Or perhaps, given how much is now accumulating, it is closer than it has ever been. But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that the giants disappeared. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that something of them remains. Not in museums, not in archives, in us. The question of what the giants left behind, if they existed, if the evidence that points toward their existence is taken seriously, is not only a question about physical remains or genetic traces. It is a question about the full range of their impact on the world they inhabited and the world that came after them. Because if a population of large-bodied, cognitively sophisticated beings lived on Earth for tens of thousands of years before their catastrophic elimination or absorption, they would have left more than bones. They would have left structures. They would have left knowledge. And they would have left the memory of themselves in the cultures that survived them. The megalithic problem. The megalithic structures of the ancient world Stonehenge, the pyramids of Giza, the temples of Baalbek, the statues of Easter Island, the constructions at Göbekli Tepe present a set of engineering challenges that conventional archaeology has never fully resolved. Not because the structures are impossible to build. They are demonstrably not impossible, they exist, and someone built them. But because the methods by which they were built, using the technology and organizational capacity attributed to the cultures that supposedly produced them, require assumptions about ancient engineering capability that are not supported by any other evidence from those cultures. The blocks at Baalbek, in modern Lebanon, include the largest quarried stone blocks in human history. The 3 stones of the trilithon still in position as part of the temple platform each weigh approximately 800 tons. A 4th stone, still in the quarry where it was cut, weighs an estimated 1,200 tons. Moving these stones from the quarry to the construction site, across terrain that would have presented significant obstacles even for modern equipment, required a capability for moving extremely heavy loads that the Bronze Age cultures attributed with their construction simply did not demonstrably possess. 1,200 tons, cut with precision, moved by people with bronze tools and rope. The conventional answer is that we underestimate ancient ingenuity that the people of the ancient world, though lacking modern machinery, had developed techniques for moving heavy loads that we have not fully reconstructed. This may be true. Ancient people were not less intelligent than modern people, and practical problem solving in conditions of material limitation can produce solutions that later generations find surprising. But the megalithic problem extends beyond Baalbek. At Pumapunku in Bolivia, at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, at the Plateau of Giza, at Malta, at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is now estimated to be approximately 12,000 years old, predating Stonehenge by 7,000 years, and placing its construction at almost exactly the Younger Dryas boundary. There are constructions whose scale and precision exceed what the cultures credited with building them are, otherwise known to have been capable of. Göbekli Tepe is particularly significant. It is the oldest known large-scale ceremonial complex on Earth. It was built by people who, according to the standard timeline, had not yet developed agriculture, who lived in small, nomadic, or semi-nomadic groups, who had no cities, no administrative hierarchy, no craft specialization beyond the basics of subsistence survival. And yet they built a structure that required quarrying and moving 20-ton stone pillars, arranging them with astronomical precision and decorating them with sophisticated iconographic programs representing animals and abstract symbols. Before farming, before cities, before any of the organizational infrastructure that supposedly makes such projects possible. Unless there was a prior civilization, one that did have that infrastructure, one that was eliminated by the Younger Dryas catastrophe, and of which the early inhabitants of the Göbekli Tepe region were the survivors or the descendants, preserving, in the construction of that monument, the memory of a knowledge tradition that the catastrophe had nearly erased. The knowledge that survives. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers, the divine beings, whose offspring were the Nephilim, as having transmitted to humanity a specific set of knowledge and capabilities that humanity was not previously supposed to possess: metallurgy, the working of metals into weapons and tools, the reading of celestial signs, and the calculation of astronomical cycles, the preparation of medicines and poisons from plants, the arts of writing and record-keeping, the construction of permanent architecture, the organization of human groups for collective projects beyond the scale of family or clan. This list is, in essence, a catalog of the capabilities that distinguish civilized from pre-civilized humanity, and the tradition preserves it as a transmission as knowledge that came from outside the ordinary human developmental trajectory, provided by beings of a different order who had reasons of their own for providing it. Whether or not one accepts the supernatural framework of the Enochian account, the underlying historical claim is interesting, that the capacities that define human civilization were not independently developed by ordinary humans through gradual trial and error, but were transmitted from a prior source, a source associated, in the tradition, with beings of extraordinary physical stature. The giants, in this reading, were not merely large, they were the teachers. And when they were gone, eliminated by the flood, absorbed into ordinary humanity, reduced by disease and disaster, and the differential arithmetic of survival, they left behind the knowledge they had transmitted, imperfectly preserved, partially understood, maintained in institutions, temples, priesthoods, mystery traditions that were designed to carry forward what their founders had known, even as the memory of the founders themselves faded into myth. The astronomical precision of the ancient megalithic monuments, the sophisticated calendrical knowledge of the Maya and the Egyptians, the mathematical knowledge embedded in the architectural proportions of the Great Pyramid, the medical and botanical knowledge preserved in ancient Indian, Chinese, and Mesoamerican traditions. These are not the independent inventions of cultures starting from scratch. They are, or at least may be, the surviving fragments of a larger knowledge tradition whose origins lie in a world that no longer exists. A world before the catastrophe, a world in which the giants taught. The astronomical legacy of all the evidence for a prior civilization associated with the giant traditions, the astronomical knowledge embedded in the ancient megalithic monuments is perhaps the most difficult to explain within the standard framework, and the most directly relevant to the question of what the giants left behind. The pyramids of Giza are aligned with the cardinal directions to within a fraction of a degree, a precision that requires not only sophisticated astronomical observation, but also the ability to transfer that observation into architectural practice at enormous scale. The internal chambers of the Great Pyramid encode, in their dimensions and proportions, mathematical relationships, including the value of pi and the ratio we call the golden mean, that were not discovered in the Western mathematical tradition until thousands of years after the pyramid was built. The Nazca lines of Peru, enormous geoglyphs visible only from altitude, include representations of constellations that correspond to the stellar configurations of a specific historical period, several thousand years before the culture conventionally credited with their construction is believed to have existed. The implication is that whoever made them was working from astronomical knowledge that predates the Nazca culture. Stonehenge's alignment with the summer solstice sunrise is well known. Less well known is the full extent of the astronomical encoding in its design, the integration of an 6-year lunar cycle into the spacing of its outer ring, the relationship between its internal geometry and the extreme positions of the moon at the horizon, the way that the entire monument functions as a predictive instrument for astronomical phenomena of considerable complexity. These monuments are not the work of people who happen to notice that the sun rises in a particular direction on a particular day. They are the work of people with a systematic, multi-generational, astronomical tradition of extraordinary sophistication. That tradition had to come from somewhere. It had to have been developed over a very long period, refined through sustained observation and calculation, and maintained in institutions capable of transmitting it across generations. And in the ancient textual record, the tradition of its origin is consistent. This knowledge was not independently developed by the cultures that used it. It was inherited from a prior civilization associated with beings of a prior age, who possessed it before the catastrophe and transmitted it, in partial and imperfect form, to the survivors. The Enochian tradition says the Watchers taught astrology. The Hermetic tradition attributes the foundations of astronomical and mathematical knowledge to figures of the pre-flood era. The Indian tradition attributes the Vedic astronomical system to the rishis of the Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, before the present diminished world. The Egyptian tradition attributes the foundation of their sciences to Thoth, a pre-dynastic figure of the time before ordinary kings, associated in some readings with the era of the giant-adjacent divine beings who preceded the human pharaohs. Every tradition says the same thing. The knowledge is older than the civilization that holds it, older than writing, older than cities, older than everything we call history. It came from before, from beings who were here before us. Whether those beings were literally giants in the physical sense, or whether giant is the cultural shorthand for different and greater than us. The consistent memory of a prior source for the foundations of human knowledge is itself significant data. It represents a specific claim repeated across independent traditions that deserves investigation rather than dismissal. The memory that refuses to die. Perhaps the most significant thing the giants left behind is the one thing that has proven most resistant to elimination. The memory of them, the ancient texts, the persistent accounts of skeletal discoveries, the mythological traditions that place a different kind of being at the beginning of human history. These have survived 3,000 years of institutional religion that had reasons to suppress them, 300 years of scientific materialism that had reasons to dismiss them, and the continuous attrition of time itself, the loss of documents, the burning of libraries, the simple entropy of cultural transmission. And they are still here. The Book of Enoch was lost to the Western tradition for over 1,000 years. Its preservation in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon was unknown to European scholars until James Bruce brought copies back from Abyssinia in 1773. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which contained multiple Enochian fragments, confirming the text's importance to the early Jewish tradition from which Christianity emerged, were not discovered until 1947. The complete text of the Sumerian king list was not assembled and translated until the 20th century. Göbekli Tepe was not excavated until 1994. The evidence keeps reappearing. It refuses to stay buried, just as the bones kept reappearing, generation after generation, in fields and mines and construction sites across the world. The ground keeps giving back what it has taken in, and what it keeps giving back, with remarkable consistency, is the same story. The honest position on the giant question is not certainty in either direction. It is not the certainty of the true believer who accepts every ancient account at face value, who sees every unusually large skeleton as definitive proof, who attributes every megalithic structure to giant builders without remainder. And it is not the certainty of the institutional skeptic who dismisses the entire question as folklore and fraud, who explains away the consistency of the ancient accounts as the universal human tendency to mythologize, who treats the pattern of the skeletal discovery, reports as noise without considering whether the pattern itself is evidence. The honest position is uncertainty that takes the evidence seriously. And taking the evidence seriously means acknowledging what it actually shows. What we actually know. We know that humans of extraordinary stature, significantly exceeding the current upper range of ordinary human height, have existed within the historical period. The case of Robert Wadlow establishes this definitively. The question is not whether such individuals can exist, but what conditions produce them, and whether those conditions could have been more widespread in the past. We know that closely related species of archaic humans, with physical characteristics that differed significantly from modern humans, existed alongside our ancestors for tens of thousands of years, that they interbred with us, and that their physical legacy persists in our genomes. The Denisovan discovery demonstrates that our understanding of archaic human diversity is incomplete in ways that were not suspected before 2010, and may remain incomplete in ways we have not yet discovered. We know that a major catastrophic event occurred at the Younger Dryas boundary approximately 12,900 years ago, an event that caused the extinction of the North American megafauna, dramatically disrupted human populations across the northern hemisphere, and corresponds in its timing and apparent characteristics to the global flood traditions that appear independently in virtually every ancient culture. We know that every major ancient civilization, without exception, preserved detailed accounts of a prior race of extraordinarily large beings who inhabited the world before a catastrophe that ended or drastically reduced them. And we know that these accounts, produced by cultures with no contact with each other, are consistent in their core elements to a degree that cannot be explained by coincidence. We know that skeletal remains consistent with extraordinary human stature were reported in significant numbers by credible observers across North America during the 19th century, and that those remains were transferred in large numbers to institutional custody and have not been made available for modern scientific study. That is what we know, not speculation, not myth, documented, verifiable fact. What the silence costs. The cost of the institutional silence around the giant question is not primarily the loss of the physical remains, though that is a real cost, representing scientific information that may never be recovered. It is the way the silence has shaped the intellectual environment around the question. When a question is not taken seriously by the institutions that most influence scientific discourse, the people who continue to find it serious are those who are, by definition, outside those institutions. And when the serious work on a question is being done outside established institutions, the quality control mechanisms that distinguish rigorous investigation from wishful thinking are not applied. The evidence is not critically evaluated. The alternative explanations are not considered. The confirmation bias that affects all human reasoning is not corrected for by the peer review and replication requirements that institutional science, at its best, provides. The result is a field of inquiry populated by both genuine researchers doing serious work and by enthusiasts whose engagement with the evidence is not disciplined by the methodological standards that would separate what is actually supported from what is merely compelling. And the institutional scientists observing this field see the enthusiasm and the methodological looseness and dismiss the entire enterprise, including the genuine researchers doing serious work as folklore. The silence creates the conditions for the dismissal. The dismissal justifies the silence, and the evidence sits, unexamined, in institutional custody or beneath the ground. The question that remains, at the end of all of this, the skeletal reports, the ancient texts, the genetic evidence, the megaliths, the catastrophe of the Younger Dryas boundary, the institutional silence, and its effects. What remains is a question that has not been answered, not because the answer is unknowable, but because the question has not been seriously asked by the people and institutions with the tools to answer it. The question is not whether giants appear in myth. They do. That is documented. The question is not whether unusually large human remains have been found and reported throughout history. They have. That is also documented. The question is not whether a catastrophic event occurred at the end of the Pleistocene that was sufficient to eliminate large-bodied populations. It did. That is also documented. The question is whether all of this evidence, taken together, points toward a reality that the standard account of human prehistory has not acknowledged. Whether there was, before the catastrophe of 12,000 years ago, a humanity that was more varied than what exists today. A humanity that included, among its variety, lineages of individuals whose physical stature exceeded anything we currently consider normal. Lineages that built monuments we struggle to explain, transmitted knowledge that forms the basis of our earliest civilizations, and were eliminated or nearly eliminated by events that the ground still carries evidence of. The question is whether the myth and the bone and the gene and the stone all tell the same story, and whether we are willing to look at them together long enough to hear what that story says. The new archaeology and what it promises. The tools available to modern archaeology have reached a point where the questions raised by the giant evidence could, in principle, be addressed with a rigor that the 19th century could not have provided. Ancient DNA analysis has transformed our understanding of prehistoric humanity in the 15 years since it became technically feasible. The identification of the Denisovans, the quantification of Neanderthal introgression in modern human genomes, the reconstruction of population movements and admixture events across tens of thousands of years of human prehistory. All of this from fragments of bone that earlier generations of archaeologists would have dismissed as too degraded to yield useful information. If any of the skeletal remains associated with the 19th century giant reports were available for ancient DNA analysis, the question of their relationship to known archaic human lineages could be addressed directly. Not inferred from mythology, not estimated from architectural anomaly. Answered with the precision that genetic sequencing now permits. The question is not whether the tools exist. The question is whether the remains exist, and whether the institutions that hold them are willing to let the tools be used. The answer to the first part of the question is uncertain. The catalog of Smithsonian holdings is not fully public. The contents of institutional storage facilities at major universities and natural history museums have never been comprehensively inventoried in ways that are publicly accessible. There are almost certainly skeletal remains in institutional custody, whose true characteristics have not been systematically studied either because they were never prioritized for study, or because the study that was conducted under earlier frameworks did not ask the questions that current methods could answer. The answer to the second question is also uncertain, but for different reasons. The political and legal context around skeletal remains in institutional custody has changed substantially since the passage of NAGPRA. The pressure to repatriate rather than study has, in many cases, made institutions less willing to conduct invasive research on remains whose provenance connects them to indigenous communities, regardless of the scientific questions those remains might answer. This creates a situation where the evidence that most directly bears on the giant question is becoming less accessible over time rather than more accessible, even as the tools for addressing it are becoming more powerful. The window for the definitive study may be closing, but it has not closed yet, and there are researchers working outside the major institutions, working with the new tools, working with an awareness of the full range of evidence who are asking the questions that the major institutions have declined to ask. Their work is proceeding. It is not peer-reviewed in the conventional sense. It is not funded by major grants. It does not have the institutional imprimatur that carries weight in the standard scientific discourse. But it is happening, and the tools do not care about institutional affiliation. The DNA is in the bone, whoever looks at it. What the ground still holds. In the spring of 2023, a team of archaeologists working in the Zagros Mountains of Iran announced the discovery of a burial site containing skeletal remains that preliminary analysis indicated were significantly outside the normal range of human stature. The announcement was brief. The follow-up was limited. The site was not, as of the most recent available information, the subject of major institutional study. In the same year, ancient DNA researchers published findings suggesting the presence of a previously unidentified archaic human genetic signature in the genomes of certain South Asian populations, a signature that did not match any known archaic lineage and whose physical correlates have not been established. And in Nevada, in a cave system known to have been occupied by a pre-contact population whose oral traditions included detailed descriptions of a prior race of red-haired giants, a tradition recorded by ethnographers in the 19th century and the same period when skeletal remains of unusual stature were reportedly excavated from the cave. The full extent of the archaeological material has never been scientifically published. The ground is still telling the story, piece by piece, site by site, gene by gene, still giving back what it has taken in. The question is whether we are listening carefully enough to hear it. The final thought: the giants are gone, or mostly gone. Gone in the sense that the world they inhabited no longer exists. Gone in the sense that the catastrophe that ended the Pleistocene eliminated the conditions, the climate, the food resources, the ecological context that had supported their existence across hundreds of thousands of years. Gone in the sense that the interbreeding and the differential survival rates of the post-catastrophe world diluted and dispersed their physical form until it was no longer recognizable as a distinct lineage, but gone in the way that anything is gone when it transforms rather than simply disappears. Their genes are in us. Their knowledge is in the monuments they left or taught others to build. Their memory is in every culture that has preserved the story of the time before the flood, the time of the heroes, the age when beings walked the earth who were not quite like us, and their bones are in the ground, waiting, with the patience that the ground always has, for the moment when someone will look carefully enough to find them and take them seriously, because the desert does not judge what it keeps. It only keeps it until the right person asks the right question at the right moment. That moment may be closer than it seems.